It's sad, tragic really, that it has taken such an eruption of violence to push these problems into the national and local conversations. But as we just heard, there is hope that now is the real time for some solutions, real solutions. And we've got more than 24 people with us in our studio right now who have agreed to share their knowledge and their opinions with us. So let us first start with one of the authors of the report that we relied so much on, Erica Nelson, if you don't mind standing up, is with the Wisconsin Center for Children and Families, and basically put together the Race to Equity report in 2013.
With the Race to Equity report and the data, I think the thing that doesn't get discussed is that everything is actually interrelated and connected, and it's not actually in a silo. So African American babies aren't just like dying because they're African American necessarily. It's because of all the stresses of all the other factors. So the criminal justice system and the reforms within the criminal justice system are related to employment, are related to housing, transportation, all of these aspects that we're talking about, the school systems, secondary education, how people feel about their college experience, their elementary educational experience, their community, their relations, it's all interrelated and inextricably linked to each other, and therefore that's why we have the numbers that we have, because it's the reflection of all these things interacting. And I think that when we talk about all the people that are in the room and all these different facets who are being intentional about how to go forward, it's that continued level of intentionality, knowing that my accountability is attached to someone else's accountability to my right and to my left.
One of the issues, of course, that has pushed this into the national conversation has involved police and police violence. You were the mentor to the last 2 police chiefs here, and now you're an outspoken critic. Talk about this.
Yes, it has not been easy. There's a number out there that I think is adding to a lot of tension in this community, and that's the number of people who are being killed. And unless the department steps up and say what they're doing to reduce the number of people who do not have firearms that are being killed, we're going to continue with this tension in the community. Number one core value of a police department ought to be the sanctity of human life. And if I'm not mistaken, ever since the 1970s, and I think it still is now, officers, that we believe in the dignity and worth of all people. And then how is that practiced? I think something's got to be done with those numbers.
Because I think a lot of the anger, a lot of the frustration that is born out of some of the incidents that we've seen on television have a lot to do with the fact that people don't understand the engagement rules that we all have as police officers. And once again, this is not the city of Madison. This is the city of Beloit. This is the city of Chicago, New York, whatever city you might be talking about. There are boards that exist in all of those states that are responsible for the rules that we all use to deal with situations.
You know, I just recently had a conversation with my 13-year-old, or who just turned 13, male boy, African American.
Are you worried about him?
I told him, take your time and be 13. Just take your time, be 13. Of course, we've had conversations about respect, conversations about values and things like that. But I want him to be a kid and grow up without the stress as much as he can of growing up.
But do you tell him to be careful, too? As we saw in the documentary, there is also that aspect.
Absolutely. I have my own experiences and personal experiences of being pulled over myself by police. And, you know, they know those stories. My family knows those stories. And I think those are the kind of real examples. But I think a lot of it comes down to respect. And a lot of it comes down to living to see another day. And so I think that's something that I try to, remind my kids about.
We've got 3 members of the Madison Police Department with us, and I'm going to work my way around. I want to talk to Officer Dion Johnson because, Officer Johnson, I know you were a field training officer with MPD. In training an officer, a white officer, how do you, get into their head, I guess, to find out where they stand on race, because that seems to be an underlying thing when push comes to shove out in the field.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's difficult, and oftentimes it's evolving. A new Academy member's opinion of race might change over time, for the better or for the worse, But in the end, that personal responsibility that we all say that is necessary for members of the public, same goes for us as well. So knowing what your limits are, knowing when, it might be that time for, a day, and a break, is important.
I see this issue as being multifold, and it's not just the police that have to do work on this element. This is a combining effort that we need the community to step forward as well and assist us. At the end of the day, the officer is trying to stay alive. At the end of the day, the officer is trying to provide protection for someone else who might be impacted by that person with a weapon.
We hear about de-escalation.
Yes.
That's a new word, or not a new word, but one that's now in the conversation here.
Well, de-escalation is not a new word. That word has been used since I've been in policing. Started in 1996, and that was a very integral part of my training. It's been a part of everyone on this panel that's been part of law enforcement. So de-escalation might be a word that's coming up more now, but it's something we've all been trained in.
Some would say that MPD is not practicing de-escalation, though, in the cases that we've seen.
Well, what I would say is that our academies train it. We train it on a consistent basis throughout your career.
Fellow black officers in morale after what we've had happen in Madison in the past year involving the police and the shootings, where does it stand, do you think?
I think the morale is pretty high. We are resilient. We're in this position for a reason, and some of the challenges we face, despite it being difficult, we do talk to one another, and we are a family. We're a law enforcement family, and
is it strained with white officers? Let me ask you that.
No, okay. It is not. That is not why we're here. There are more than enough white officers who are embracing the situation and realize that changes need to be made. We are here because we still believe we can make a difference. We're in a department that understands the challenges that are ahead of them. We could get better. We would like to see, and I think I speak for both Howard and Dion, we'd like to see more minorities in the police department. We need to make sure that our department reflects what's out there in society, and I guess what I would like to see is just a better understanding of what we do. If they can't be part of the police department, then get involved in the Citizens Academy and understand what we do and how we do it. I think that would open a lot of eyes about when certain situations come, especially deadly force. You could have a better understanding of it. And then, of course, for us to understand the cultural differences out there too and continue our training.
Officer, thank you. As we saw in the documentary, police violence force isn't the only issue. Incarceration rates as well. And I want to talk to Sheriff Dave Mahoney.
It's a criminal justice-wide problem. The issues of mass incarceration of people of color is a problem of not only policing and the discretions that are given to law enforcement officers, which is very broad. I mean, the spectrum of discretion goes to beginning with ignoring it, to decide, the outcomes should be based upon the threat to the community and what we need to do to end that threat. And if it's a violation of law, what do we need to do to ensure that person showing up in court? It doesn't mean that everybody has to be arrested and brought to jail.
We have developed over the past 3 or 4 decades a very narrow sense of what it means to hold people accountable when they do something wrong. And we've decided largely in the American imagination that punishing someone for crime means locking them in a cage, with all due respect, Sheriff. And I want to stand up for the sheriff because he takes who gets sent to him. He doesn't make that decision himself. The system is fed, as he pointed out, at many points along the way. Many discretionary decisions get made. But there are also lots of other ways that we can hold people accountable and punish them and move them forward to be more productive members of our society without heavy reliance on jails and on prisons as our primary method of punishment. And when we look at more community-based solutions, we not only reduce mass incarceration, but we allow people to stay in communities where they can do things like get jobs and continue their education in a meaningful way and get access to community-based health care and take care of all of the other problems that, as we know from the documentary, feed what we call compounded disadvantage in the system.
We certainly need an opportunity to talk to the community about, you know, the continuum of force and why law enforcement does what they do. But before we even get there, law enforcement needs to keep their mouth shut and open their ears in the community, meet with community members and hear what they're being impacted with. Then we can begin putting together how we are going to police our communities.
There are those who say the community should be a lot more involved, Sheriff, to the point that the community operates law enforcement to a degree. What are your thoughts on taking it that far?
Well, I agree. I'm, as a law enforcement officer, I'm allowed to police because the community allows me to. The authority that's given to me and given to every law enforcement officer across this country, local, state, and federal, is done at the will of the people. And I think this profession needs to spend more time listening to the communities and how they're being impacted by our decisions and restructuring and rethinking how we go forward as we police.
The City of Madison and community leaders recently announced a $15.3 million over 3-year plan to end violence and to try to solve some of the racial disparities. This is new, and Alder Matt Fair was one of the chief architects. Let's talk about the accountability. How are you going to measure this 15.3-year, $3 million plan so that you can show us that it works?
That's a great question. And in all honesty, the City of Madison has a long way to go as an entity to measure and measure outcomes. It really does. So I'm not sure I can give you a great answer here because that's something we need to improve on. Most of the time, we measure programs on how many kids were involved, how many contacts were made. That's not measurement, really. How does do kids graduate that were in this program? Do kids, what's their third grade reading levels? Like, we can use those community outcome standards, I think, to do better measuring of the programs that we're talking about, because that's the kind of outcomes that we're looking for our kids. So we have a ways to go on that, but I think we're moving in the right direction there.
As I look at the 15-point plan, absolutely, I'm glad. What I'm glad is that the city is finally taking responsibility of saying this is a priority and we need to look at that. So that's a good thing. But I will be looking at the action. So my colleague said, how do you measure that? The measurement is that are the programs reaching to the folks that need it most?
We are in a moment of crisis, right? Nationally and within our city. And I think that's what's going to move us along this time. I think as we're talking about measurement, Alder Fair is correct. I think we really need to do a better job of doing that. But as the mayor said yesterday at the press conference, racism is killing us. And we don't need the data to tell us how we feel. When we feel racism, it's there. We feel it. So I think we need the data. But we also need to focus on the relational aspect of this. How do we feel living in this community and the two cities? And we need to really focus on that. So I think there are many things that we need to do. I think we need to focus on the data. I think we are in a really crisis situation now that we are in desperate need. If we do not step out on this, we will fail as a city. And we recognize that.
There's a lot of talk that this is the perfect time for the perfect change. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I'm born and raised here. And so I have seen, to me, I was there when my parents were raising me, 2-parent household, and life was okay here. And then I've seen now, as I've grown up, that these same things that I've had and experienced, others aren't having. And so my question always becomes, well, what's going on? What's happening? And for me, it is a community that doesn't seem to be necessarily pulling together, but creating these divisions. And so we have a lot of different pots and a lot of different people doing things, which is great, but we're not doing them together.
I believe that the only way you're ever going to change anything, if I want to change you, I have to have a relationship with you. I have to walk with you. I have to understand you. I don't care whether you're white, black, Native American. I have to have a relationship before I can change anything. And until we start to understand that we need each other, nothing's ever going to change. It's going to stay the same way. Rhetoric, all the talk, it's going to stay that way unless we see that we need one another.
I think it starts with young people. It starts with changing the minds of young people in the way that they view race, the way that they view the people that are around them. The one thing that I see with young people is they are so resilient. You know, they see race, but sometimes they don't want to talk about it because they learn from their parents. But I tell them it starts with love. We all are created equally. And when you love yourself and when you love your brothers and sisters, the difference and the change starts with you.
When you talk solutions to your congregation, what are you talking about?
Well, one of the big problems I think that the documentary really highlighted that we haven't talked about that much is white privilege. Okay. White privilege is just a huge problem.
Define that for me, because I think a lot of people hear that and go, what are you talking about?
Yeah, the pastor of our Chinese ministry defines it like this: white privilege is the privilege that white people don't have to think about race. And so they're blind to it. There's kind of a white transparency. They never think about it.
How do you get people to step out of that comfort zone, especially whatever we're at, 85 to 90% white population?
I would say to them, you have to just do something small, something that's just really, sometimes these problems are so complex, and there's systemic changes that need to take place. And for many people, they hear that and they just go, what can I do? But I think sometimes small things can make the biggest difference. I mean, if you just walk across the room and talk to someone who's different from you, if you just try to make a conversation with someone who doesn't look like you, I mean, just do that. I think that changes things so much. I mean, people are profiled in our community, and if you don't sit across the table with someone who's actually experienced that, it's just a number on a report, and it doesn't mean anything to you. But I have a great African-American friend, and he said to me, Chris, when you go into a store, you're Chris. When I go into a store, I'm a black man. Most white people don't think like that unless they actually are intentional about trying to make a friend, doing something outside of their comfort zone, being intentional about it, really practicing the words of Jesus, actually, and just stepping across the room and doing something small, introducing themselves, trying to make friends with someone who's not like them.
All right, if you're wondering what to do, he just told you. Pastor, thank you. Jamel.
We've talked a lot about relationship building. The company I run works to help build relationships via entertainment. We provide spaces where people can get together and have conversations over a drink, over music. We provide entertainment that looks at attracting and retaining young professionals of color in our city. If we look at the back end of diversity, we have to look at what our city offers in order to retain a diverse population in our city. That not only helps our stats, that helps our children be able to see volunteers or big brothers, big sisters that don't disappear after a few years because they found a home here in Madison. That helps the talent-making machine of the UW that we have be able to retain the students that graduate because they found a home in Madison. That also provides a space where professionals that are having a difficult time because they're the only person of color in their department, or they're the only person of color in their entire workforce, they have a place to come to vent, and they know that they have a network of people.
Paul Fanlon, I have wanted to get your perspective on this for some time. The publisher and editor of the Capital Times, a longtime reporter here in Madison. What's your take on this? What went wrong here?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is I've been here for more than 35 years, so I'm one of those who's complicit in how we got here. I think one of the biggest problems in Madison, as I've really focused on this over the last few years, is how little social interaction there is across racial lines. African Americans need to be in the driver's seat on these solutions. And I know accountability always comes up, and what are the metrics, and what's it look like down the road. But I've just felt over the last 2 or 3 years it's critical that we do not have the same level of motivation as people like Alex G and a lot of other people in the room here And we need to respect that, and we need to have them be making the decisions and allocating the money and be in that position. I've been around the philanthropic community enough to know that the perception from the African American community is that's not often enough the case.
We all need to be able to walk away from this documentary with 1, 2, or 3 things we know we can do. And so one question I have for everyone here in the audience and all your viewers is, have you participated in anti-bias training? Do you work with your human resource department to look at hiring and promoting individuals who are people of color, people with identified or not identified disabilities? In what ways are we engaging our community in interracial experiences, dialogue, conversations?
I want to talk to Patrick Sims, the diversity officer with the University of Wisconsin. It was a challenging spring semester at the UW. A lot went on, and a lot of it was negative racially. What's going to happen this fall? What's going to be different this fall?
Well, that's $1 million question. I think the main thing is, from our vantage point, we're really trying to focus on preparing what will likely be an equally challenging semester. I mean, have the election coming up. Our students are expecting responses or things to be in place based on some of the plans that we're talking about over the course of the last year and a half. My task in all of this is to stay the course. So much of what we do as it relates to diversity and inclusion, at least from the institution's perspective, is we're always reacting. We're always trying to respond. And because of the instantaneous nature of social media, I mean, we saw that arrest for the young man in classroom happen in real time almost. I mean, literally a 5-minute differential from when it happened, it was on Facebook. And so the extent to which we're mindful of how we communicate and how we talk about the things that we're putting in place, my good colleague Jolando Jackson said, this stuff didn't happen overnight. It's not going to be solved overnight. And so how we talk about preparing solutions and setting expectations, that's one of my key pieces that I want to emphasize for our students. So building those infrastructures that give folks a chance to look behind the curtain and see what it really takes to make that happen. So those are things that we're focusing on. We're also focusing on being more intentional, as the Reverend said. You know, from my standpoint, one of the things that I always talk about at the institution, we talk about our values. Right? What are our values? Our statements about diversity and inclusion and our commitment to social justice. We know what the Wisconsin idea is. We know what the motto of the state is. What's our collective thinking about diversity and inclusion as an institution? And so those very subtle, unsexy things that are the bedrock of how we comport and engage one another, that's the heavy lifting that we're doing that won't bear the immediate fruit that people are looking for, but it'll set us on the right path long term. So it is at times overwhelming, can be soul depleting, to be quite honest, but at the same time it's encouraging because the kinds of opportunities and just hearing the interest of folks in this room, that's the thing that gives me reason to remain hopeful. A large part of it has to do with what I'm characterizing as our values, right? So what are those values? Because when our students enter our doors, they didn't just get those racist values overnight. I mean, there were things that were in place long before we ever engaged with them as students or members of the UW-Madison community. How do we set those expectations? So I love what Brandon was talking about, looking at young people and how young people are sort of moldable in the sense that they can be the best of champions, they can be the worst of demons. And the onus is on us is to ensure they're on the right path so the kind of future that we want to see happening is actually coming to fruition, and we continue to layer in the spaces where those opportunities build and build and build.
Kids are not born racist. They have to be taught.
We're not.
All right, Patrick, thank you. What about more black teachers and more black history in the curriculum? Those 2 points that were brought up in the program.
Yep. So around hiring, our HR department is deeply committed to understanding the barriers and the issues that we've had with getting more people of color into our teaching staff. We are working on some partnerships with the university, with the School of Education, really thinking about pipeline talent development opportunities. We've got another high school program where we're taking our high school students who have expressed an interest in being future educators, who are students of color, and really working on making sure that we can kind of retain them. But guess what? We got a lot of work to do. And as Howard Fuller said in the documentary, it's going to be hard to change that lever until you have more kids of color graduating, then going on to post-secondary and graduating and choosing education as their field. So a lot of work still to be done, but I feel like the Madison School District is committed. We know that we do not have enough teachers of color in the classroom providing high quality instruction and being the role models that we know our kids need.
Well, I think the number one issue right now to address, especially with some of the teachers that are non-diverse, they have to feel comfortable and receive the training to be able to handle that uncomfortable situation.
White teachers.
Bingo. I mean, if a kid is having an issue, there are several kids at our school that was going through some troubled times. And for a kid to walk into a classroom with the same clothes on 5 days in a row, as a teacher, just take time and say, hey, are you going through something? Can I help you? Do you want to see a counselor? Too often the teachers, I think, sometimes they're pushing to address the achievement gap, but they're not taking time to build a relationship. So in the position that I am, multicultural service coordinator, there's times where I might just sit in my office and talk to a student. Because what you got to remember, and Reverend Barron can help me out, he's a good friend of my family. There were 3 strongholds back in the days that were strong in the black community. It was a church, it was a school, and it was a house, the home. As of right now, a lot of pressure is either put on the church, there's extreme pressure being put on the school. And at home, if you're a parent that are struggling, you don't have time to give your kids the values. Like Officer Payne said, the respect piece. Each 3 of those strongholds focus on faith, respect, communication, and you had a goal. Unfortunately, some of the students of color going to college is a destination, not a goal. And that's a big difference. So as educators, as community people, we got to spend time and help them get that goal, to go there, not a destination. Because if it's a destination, you're going to go for 1 year, you're going to drop out, and then you're going to fall back.
I hear a lot of success stories about individual programs, and then, but I don't think we've invested enough in them. They feel like pilot programs. There's a program over here or over there. Nonprofits come into our offices and either want a grant or editorial support, and the programs are actually quite effective, but they're not scaled up to a degree that they're really going to change the terrain for white people out there. There's an economic argument behind this beyond the human argument, is that we're going to fall behind as a city and a county and a state if we don't do a better job of being a different kind of place.
What comes to your mind in the way of solutions, your group, and what do you really suggest people do here?
I think our responsibility in groundwork is to work with other white people, to talk about racism, to learn history, to understand history, to think about the 200, 300 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, and we're about 60 years out of legalized slavery. So we have a long way to go.
So education is a big part of what you're doing.
Education is a big part of what we do. And as a mother, talking to my kids from when they're very young, and, they're not afraid to say Black Lives Matter, and I feel like that's rewiring their brains and like a long generation and history of pain and trauma that impacts us all.
I didn't understand that when Social Security was set up, that domestic workers and farm workers were excluded. And in terms of supporting your elders in their old age and what you do with the income you have, your parents, not only did they not have the house that they talked about in the special post-World War II, but they also didn't have Social Security income to help them in their old age. So as a younger person, you start behind financially. You don't get the gift from the prior generation. But also you have greater responsibility, because everybody has the emotional responsibility for taking care of their elders or their family. But this is an extra layer that the kids have financial responsibility for taking care of their elders.
But when you look at that documentary, there's so many pieces that we really do need to go to a deeper level. We need to talk about fear. We need to talk about microaggression. We need to talk about those things that keep us apart. And as a community, we want to stay up here, where it's comfortable and it's all warm and fuzzy. But really, if you're going to face this in a real significant way, you're going to have to be in conversation. People say, well, I'm tired of talking. But you know what? If you know my story and I know your story, then you are more likely to say, wow, I didn't even think about that. And until we as a community start working at that level of really intentionally getting to know one another and hearing each other's story, that tape is not going to rewind. And that's what we need to do as a community, to rewind those tapes, and then you'll have a movement toward what we all want, is a community that not two Madisons, but a Madison that equity and justice for all.
Our conversation here is only a beginning to addressing these issues. We'll continue to follow up on what we've talked about, and we invite you to share our documentary and discussion, which you'll find on WKOW.com. We also hope you'll carry on the conversation in your home, community, and on our WKOW Facebook page. Look, these problems affect us all, and they won't go away on their own, so we'll all need to be a part of the solutions. Thanks for joining us.